with our oceans. Really serious weather problems can be caused by heating and cooling the oceans to create El Nino effects and other similar weather engines. So in other words, they can create an artificial El Nino. And these, we know the problems. We've all heard it on the news. You have droughts, you have forest fires, you have deaths due to heat waves, flooding, and other fringe benefits. By fringe benefits, I mean all of this stuff increases the people's reason to think, oh, maybe global warming is real. Oh, gee, maybe we ought to sign the Kyoto Treaty. Maybe all of the tree huggers are really right, you know. When actually, it probably is more likely the Russians fooling around with our weather. Now, I mentioned something earlier about the school shootings at Columbine and elsewhere. It's important to realize that if you are a student, as I was, of psychology, I used to be a licensed master social worker, you know that if a person has a mental disorder, if they're depressed, if they're, you know, behavior disordered or whatever the case might be, and all of a sudden there's a very sudden drop or rise in barometric pressure, you know what that does? That pushes the person over the edge. It can very easily make them snap. And so what the Russians, I believe, have been doing is they have been dropping these globes over these cities, and they're assuming that somebody there in that city is going to be, you know, a few fries short of a Happy Meal, and they're going to go out and they're going to do something violent. Now, I'm not saying this is the only reason for, like, post office shootings, school shootings, etc. There's many reasons for them. I believe part of it is the fact that we have all this violence in our media, violent video games, lack of good parenting, and also, of course, the fact that most of the kids that are involved in these shootings, and most of the adults, for that matter, are on powerful psychotropic drugs like Prozac. And that's kind of the worst kept secret about all of this. So all this stuff is used to advance the control of the gun control lobby, the drug lords, and I don't mean the ones in Colombia, folks. I mean Eli Lilly, I mean Pfizer, I mean Merck, and of course the psychiatric lobby. And then, of course, there's also our wonderful president and his program to have no child left undrugged. Then, of course, there's the earthquake threat. We've already heard from Defense Secretary Cohen that electromagnetic induction of earthquakes is now recognized. And on the left side of your screen, you see there a graphic from a magazine from like many years ago showing Tesla sitting there and the earth blowing apart in two like an apple being split in two. You know, that statement I used back at the beginning of the meeting. Something definitely is going on in the earthquake department. Seismologists have noted that the frequency of earthquakes is going up faster and faster and faster. When I was out in California, someone told me they had 5 earthquakes out there just in the last couple of days. In the early 1900s, the normal rate of large earthquakes was 2 or 3 a year. Well, to this time, like for example in 2000, in 1 week, they had 20 major earthquakes. We all know about the tsunami that happened earlier, and you know, I mean, this kind of stuff is going to happen more and more, partly I think because people are tampering with this. You can create an earthquake with scalar energy. You just have to be patient. You just gradually send scalar beams into somewhere where you know that there is in fact a fault line. The energy builds up, the tectonic plates gradually slip, and then all of a sudden there's this catastrophic slip, and you have a huge destructive earthquake. And let's say you live in a part of the country where there aren't many earthquakes. There's no fault lines. Well, that doesn't matter. You can use scalar technology even to create a flat plate earthquake. So you can't run, you can't hide, folks. Probably the most obvious example of using scalar energy in this fashion was the Yugoslav earthquake of 4/15/79. Now, why we think this was scalar is the earthquake was immediately followed by a cold explosion. And that's going to be very significant, as we'll see in a few minutes. This had a magnitude of 7.2 on the Richter scale, which is a pretty powerful earthquake. It had an epicenter of 33 kilometers deep and more than 100 aftershocks. The other significant thing is that it happened in April. And somebody asked, well, what's important about April? I says, well, it's income tax day. But that's not really the reason. The reason is that in the old days of the Soviet Empire, they would have a huge meeting of the Supreme Soviet in very early May every year. It was like their big holiday. And so they'd usually, if they were going to do something big, they do it right in April, because that way they could have something to kind of brag and beat their chests about at their big meeting. Then, of course, there's scalar waves and supervolcanoes. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about the fact that we have our very own supervolcano in Yellowstone. And essentially what you're seeing there on the screen is Yellowstone Falls, and a beautiful place, and that's part of what's called the Yellowstone caldera in geology. And there's been many things on the media, Discovery, whatever, about how there's this enormous magma dome underneath Yellowstone, which supposedly is overdue right now for an eruption. And if it is, it would be like 5 or 10 times worse than Mount St. Helens, minimum. And I had a fellow come up to me at one of the meetings who is a Christian, who's a geologist, and he said, what I'm about to share with you is absolutely true. The geologists know about this, that's why it's going out in the media. The problem is that this caldera in Yellowstone has been targeted already, we are told, by scalar weapons. So they've got it in their crosshairs, so to speak. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is, if you're familiar with a supervolcano, if this thing erupts, first of all, it's going to probably take out most of Wyoming, just in the first few seconds. Probably part of Utah, part of Idaho, part of Montana. The next thing that's going to happen is, because again, we're talking about maybe 6, 7 volcanoes erupting virtually very much close to each other in time. There's going to be huge amounts, tons and tons of ash being sent up into the atmosphere. And because the prevailing winds tend to blow from west to east, it's going to go out over the Great Plains states, and essentially, if you're in the Great Plains states like Nebraska or, even Iowa, you're going to get like 5 to 10 feet of ash dumped on you. And I tell you, I had a colleague in the ministry, Ed Decker, who lived out in Seattle when Mount St. Helens erupted. And he was driving over the Lake Washington Bridge. And he said that stuff was coming down. It was like the worst blizzard you'd ever seen. You couldn't hardly see anything. Cars were skidding around on the bridge. Cars were stalling because this ash gets in the air filter of your car. And it was a mess. And see, that was just one measly volcano. This thing is going to be probably 5 to 10 times worse than that. So you might as well figure that the whole Midwest is going to be wiped out. And that even as far east as Indiana, they're going to still have, a lot of ash and stuff, killing millions and millions of people, millions and millions of livestock, basically wipe out our breadbasket, the whole Midwestern America. And of course, if you remember when Mount St. Helens erupted, it darkened the sky for many days in parts of the country. And it was literally like the book of Revelations, where you could not see the sun. The sun was dark and the moon looked red at night, because this stuff was up in the sky and it was actually changing the spectrograph of the atmosphere. So, this is one thing you've really got to pray about, folks, because whether or not the scalar waves hit it, supposedly this thing can go off at any time. Then we have the Challenger disaster. This is probably the most spectacular use of scalar weapons against a U.S. target to date.